Hi everybody, and welcome to Project Dreammaker. And I'm thrilled today to be joined by Gilles Charette. He uses him pronouns as the executive director of HARS, that's the HIV Aids Regional Services, which is an organization that provides support, education, and harm reduction services to individuals living with and affected by or at risk of HIV infection in southeastern Ontario. Gilles, so great to have you on the show, man. Thanks for coming.
It's great to see you, Stephen, after I was trying to do the math. I think it's over 26 years.
Yeah, just that. I could see the white in my it just gets whiter and whiter in my beard, right? Yeah, but thanks for reminding me how old we are. That's great. And so now this podcast, I interview artists and entrepreneurs, but I have another category, and it's called For Those in the Game. And this is where you fall under that roof, where we want to talk to people who either run NPOs or do work. I have another someone who works with the homeless coming on the show, because it's its own form of entrepreneurship, right? And we're going to talk about what you run, the NPO that you run, and how they've grown that, because it's very much like growing a business, right? Except the work that you do is really important. And I've said this on the show before. This podcast is about people who are starting out and starting over. And of course, I had a younger guest, make the point that, it doesn't matter how old you are. And I was really appreciative of that, because I released my own online course a couple of years ago. But we want to talk about the beginnings, because what I found is with entrepreneurs and with artists and with those who do what you do, a lot of that is formed when we're young. And so let's take me a little bit back to your childhood and how you grew up and how that sort of informed you.
Sure. Well, I'm the oldest of 4 children, grew up in Northern Ontario in a mining community, Sudbury, the nickel capital of the world. My dad was a miner, worked underground for 30 years. My mother was a registered nurse. Mother loved her job. Dad didn't care for his and couldn't wait to retire. I identify as a gay man, and I knew that I was different without the language for what that meant when I was really young. And one of the things that I've discovered is that my experience is similar to that of many gay men, in that when you feel like you don't belong, you do, or you feel like your identity or something that's core to your identity isn't being validated by society. You do things to compensate for that. And so many of us, overachieve or get involved in something where we can get praise for something that's sort of external to who we are. So that was very much my experience growing up in a small, remote community. I mean, Sudbury's pretty geographically isolated. And, considering that I, grew up in the 80s, really, pre-social media, LGBTQ plus representation on television, there was really a sense of isolation and sense of being alone and the only person like me. So I also, think that I had an experience, young, the loss of a sibling that really marked things for me. You think about those turning point moments, and
Right.
Where you learn significant lessons in your life. And for me, that loss that I experienced when I was around, 5 or 6 years old, I developed a tape where I felt like I was responsible for protecting and looking after people, particularly my family, because if I didn't, I would lose them. And so another thing that was connected to that is the role that spirituality and faith and religion played in my childhood, in that through the experience of that loss, my mother in particular turned to her faith for solace and comfort. And through her experience, and this was in the time of, the height of television, TV evangelism, the PTL Club, 100
Right.
that stuff. My mother got connected to a church in Sudbury, and years later, when I myself was looking for something, I got connected to it too. And so even though we came from, like a sort of a lower middle class background, the sense of ethics that I was raised in, both informed by, my parents, but also the connection to our faith, is, the whole line about, to whom much is given, much is required. And
Right.
so I was taught generosity and a sense of looking out for marginalized people from my parents and my grandparents, but also as somebody who identified as being different. I think I was always sort of tuned in to for lack of a better word, the suffering that people experience when they're marginalized. And so, yeah, I guess that's a little bit about, how I came to this work, is just my own experience of seeking validation, looking for my people. One of the things that's sort of ironic, as a gay man, is that I found a sense of community in a church that ultimately didn't validate or welcome me. And so it's that sense again of being an outsider to things that I think probably sensitized me to the experience of other people who feel like they're outside of things.
Yeah, and I know you've talked about this, and this is fascinating to me, that the one place that you were getting acceptance from was a church where you had to hide who you were, right? And when did you realize, you say you knew you were different, when did you realize that you were gay? Is there a certain point?
Yeah, I think that I knew that I was different without necessarily having, gay language for it. I
Right.
was really young, probably, under 6 years old. And, I knew that, I had, I wouldn't even call them attractions, because I don't think that you're, sexually mature or even curious at that age, but a sense of being drawn to, whether it's male energy, but also, most of my friends were, the girls in school or the girls in the
Right.
neighborhood. I was into, and again, so much of this is a stereotype, but, in my case, a lot of those stereotypes bore out. I was, into the arts and, into, fashion and making things pretty, and wasn't, especially good at sports, or at least team sports. And so, again, very much the stereotype. But yeah, when I started at, I think it was 16 years old, I sort of to, backtrack a little bit,
No, that's good.
a couple of years with my mother, so dabbling in this evangelical church that we were attending, and my um, maternal grandfather, who is very devout but Catholic. We were raised Roman Catholic. At one point said, okay, either you're going to raise the kids, in the Roman Catholic Church, you're going to raise the kids, in this evangelical church, but you're going to confuse the kids. And I think that was his way of saying, I don't really approve of this, and you need to come back, which is ultimately what my mother did. And so, we stayed in the Roman Catholic Church. And when I was a teenager and starting to ask questions about all sorts of things, and I think part of my involvement in the church was a sense of affinity, but also a sense of feeling like I've got to do what I can to not be who I am, because that's not acceptable. And so if I was getting involved in a church, then I was doing something that people would validate me for. But also subconsciously it was, well, maybe this is the thing that's going to make me not feel the way that I feel. Maybe God will, save me from this or make me different. And so I, around 16 years old, had this sense of seeking out something else. And I had this memory from years before of, that church being a really warm, welcoming place. And lo and behold, it kind of was. So I went on my own, had a driver's license. I went into this, church on a Sunday morning by myself. Happened to see somebody that I went to high school with. Wasn't like I was friendly with, but we weren't in the same classes. And she and a group of her friends said, well, why don't you come sit with us? Which was so foreign to me, because you go to a Roman Catholic mass, you sit with your family facing forward. It's not an especially social place. You're counting the minutes, and if the priest is going over his 8 minutes for his homily, you're thinking like, okay, we've got brunch plans here. Let's get out. So the idea of going to church and sitting with your friends was just so foreign to me. And then afterwards, I'll never forget this. They invited me for lunch with them at Swiss Chalet, which
Swiss Chalet, yes.
oh yeah, all the Christian kids go to Swiss Chalet after church. And so for me, I thought, oh my goodness, like I don't know these people, but they've welcomed me, and then they extended, an invitation to, be part of their circle. And so for somebody who felt on the outside of things up until then, my whole life, feeling like I was included somewhere was different. And there's no question it was really appealing. And then, shortly after, I got involved in some youth leadership stuff. And then, when high school was, ending, I started thinking about what's next and enrolled in Bible college. And again, part of that was this sense of, there were two things going on, both the sense of, calling, as they talk about it in, in religious circles, around having a sense of, whether it's destiny or, something that you are compelled to have to do. And then part of it was fulfilling this sense of, if I do all of these things, maybe I won't actually be gay. Maybe there's something that I can do to stop this from happening. The whole Pray the Gay Way, and I got involved in some, what was known as, ex-gay ministry or reparative therapy, thankfully only for a short time, because I don't know what to attribute it to, but I had a sense while I was going through it that A, it wasn't going to work, and B, it was clear to me that there were two different things going on. There was my relationship with my spirituality, and then the relationship with this spiritual community. And where, I knew in my heart, for me, that being rejected from one did not mean being rejected from the other. And, so I came to the conclusion, after a couple of years in Bible college, that A, my sexual orientation was going to change, but B, my creator, however you want to define that entity, that thing that's greater than we are, accepted me, even if this community wouldn't. And I also, had the good fortune of knowing that I had a family that was a soft place to land. And my leaving this faith community would not also mean leaving my family. And I've got friends who've had very similar experiences to me, whose families were also in the evangelical church. And their experience of coming out was very, very different, because they also had to confront the potential that they would also lose their families. And I didn't have to worry about that. I always knew that, that even though it might take them a while to come along, that they eventually would, and they did. And my family's been incredibly supportive, and I'm very, very fortunate.
Yeah, I've heard, I've had a couple of friends who they came out and they lost their families, and the parents in that world, that evangelical world, just said no, right? Like they just couldn't accept it. And I think back to, I was also raised Catholic and moved to the evangelical. I remember as a teenager, young teenager, what you're saying about just trying to get out of church. I mean, I would stand in the back with the ushers. I'm at this Italian Catholic church. Hey, what are you guys doing? What are we eating for lunch? Right? And then just trying to let's go. And then that experience of going to an evangelical church where you are sitting with your friends, it's a very, for me, and I wasn't an outsider, right? I am like every bit of privilege, right? Educated, straight, white, and male. And I'm aware of all of that. I was an outsider in the sense of I was a young artist who didn't know it yet. And so for me, that was special, right? To feel that embrace. But I can only imagine what it would be like for you, where you want the embrace, but you can't tell them who you really are, because then they're not going to accept you for that, which is super heartbreaking to me that we still see this happen. I want to move on to you after you. So you come out and you have some, like, your story, man, is amazing. But so you come out and you get married, and we're definitely gonna go back to that. So you get married, and your husband you and your husband moved to Prince Edward County in 2005, and you run a couple of small businesses. What kind of businesses were you running?
Well, getting back into, gay stereotypes, when my husband and I were daydreaming about eventually leaving the, hustle and bustle of, the city of Toronto where we were both working and living, we started thinking about, well, okay, what would a smaller community look like? What would be important for us as far as places to be, and what would we do when we got there? And I had the good fortune of, working for a business at the time where I had some flexibility around telecommuting, and that was a relatively new thing then. And so I thought, well, I could probably, reduce my hours of work a little bit and then start this business. So what we did was we bought, a big century home right in downtown Picton. Downtown Picton, I say that in air quotes, population 4,000. But opened a bed and breakfast, which we ran for a few years. And that was a really cool way of getting to know the community that we would now be living in. It forced us to get out there and see all there was to see so that we could make recommendations to our guests. And this was before, Airbnb and that whole short-term accommodation exploded. But around the time that people's awareness of Prince Edward County as a tourist destination beyond just Sandbanks Provincial Park was beginning, and there were fewer accommodations than there were tourists. So we were very busy and successful, but we learned, in particular me, that as much as the tasks around running a bed and breakfast were enjoyable, and I enjoyed, greeting guests and, preparing the food and doing the, the books and the registrations and
Right.
for days, I actually didn't enjoy my house feeling like it was public space. And so I tired of that pretty quickly, but then opened a design business. So I had a retail store that, sold home decor items, and it was the feeder to an interior decorating business that I ran for about 8 years. And, part of that I ran part-time while I was working where I am now. It was just a pretty creative time when you're working in a small community that's kind of emerging as a place. It feels like there's all sorts of opportunity to be entrepreneurial because you start identifying these little holes where it's like, oh, the town doesn't have this thing. So here's an opportunity for someone who's entrepreneurial, or, oh, we don't have, a natural food shop, or, oh, we don't have a kitchenware place, or, oh, we don't have this service. And so, back in the mid 2000s, there was a lot of that going on. And there still is. I mean, Prince Edward County is kind of exploding right now, but you came in at a time where you could do something that felt small but would have big impact because the population was so small. And it also got me really interested in municipal politics, because you really see the impact of whatever decision is made impacts the people living in that community, directly. And anything that you get involved in by way of, nonprofit work, community work, charity work has visible, tangible impact. And so that's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that we forget about the importance of municipal politics, at least certainly within, your field, and we're gonna get to what you do now, but it gets overlooked a lot. One of the guests on the show that I'm gonna have is the executive vice president of the Ontario Liberal Party, and there is this thing where it's like, oh, the province or the country, and certainly that's important. But you're right, on a local level, especially in smaller places, and I've seen this in my hometown. It makes a huge difference, like how you connect to that, and we're gonna connect to that right there, because you run now this nonprofit that you've grown from 9 to 70 staff. And tell me a little bit about what HARS does, because I know from our pre-interview and talking to you and like what it was like for HIV and that scare for gay men, particularly in the 90s, was like.
Yeah.
And now it feels like we've come we've come a distance from that. But can you draw a tie between what you do now and then what it was like for you in the 90s as a gay man living in fear of HIV?
Yeah, there's a few things that come to mind when I think about your question, Stephen, and one is one of the earliest memories that I have that are related to my sexuality and HIV/AIDS was there was a made-for-TV movie sometime in the, I think, late 80s, mid to late 80s, called An Early Frost. And I remember watching it on television and feeling a sense of identification and also dread. And I remember the film ending, and it's one of these, back in the time, and it's only more recently that we're seeing positive representation in the media of 2S LGBTQ plus people, but at the time, most of the portrayals were tragic. And so here was a story of, a young man essentially coming home to die of AIDS. And I thought, as I was watching this, even though I was still developing language around it and also conflicted around, like, am I really gay? I hadn't had any sexual experiences, but I knew where my attractions were, and I was fighting all of that. And I thought, oh gosh, all the more reason to stay in the closet, because if I act on this, or if I embrace my identity, this is a foregone conclusion for me, because that was the narrative at the time, is that gay men equals die of AIDS. And I came of age at a time where it was really the height of the losses. And so when I moved to Toronto in 95, just after Bible college, happened to coincide with the peak of HIV/AIDS related deaths, particularly in North America, in what we refer to as GBMSM, gay, bi, or other men who have sex with men, within that community in particular. And I was working in a church, a large progressive church that's also a social justice organization that's been on the vanguard of a number of different human rights issues, not the least of which is queer rights issues. And at the time that I started working there, we were doing on average 2 funerals a week, and mostly of young gay men, who I'd say 20s, 30s, 40s, certainly younger than I am now. And I was young, fresh out of school, so a little bit outside of the generation that was most impacted, but I got a front row seat from the standpoint of assisting people in their experience of loss at a really young age. And so that was my connection, both as somebody who identifies as a gay man, and for gay men of my age and older than me, and a little less so today for someone who's young and just coming out. A lot of our identity is there's a shadow or a cloud that hangs over it, and that is HIV/AIDS, because of that association between HIV/AIDS and gay men or bisexual men. And so the work that I do now is, I've had a series of what I like to, Oprah would call full circle moments, right? So the idea of feeling rejected by a church, and then, leaving, Bible college and thinking, okay, well, clearly ministry is not in the cards for me, even though I feel this drawing towards it. And then, being employed by a church, essentially doing the work of ministry. And then years later, happening upon a job posting when I was, leaving the corporate world, and I was looking for, a short-term job while I kind of found my feet and decided what was next for me. And it happened to be in an HIV service organization. So HARS, or HIV AIDS Regional Services, where I'm the executive director, it's an organization that's been active in Southeastern Ontario since 1988. And a lot of HIV service organizations were, birthed out of this crisis time in the, mid to late 80s and early 90s, where, governments weren't doing enough. The stigma against the LGBT community was so strong that people didn't want to touch it. And so it was it was the community and our allies who mobilized to look after our people. Now, it's not to say that HIV/AIDS exclusively is impacting queer people. It's not. But the narrative at the time was we were disproportionately impacted, and so it was mostly queer people and allies who mobilized to create these mechanisms to provide care and support. Eventually, they started receiving, government funding and funding from other sources, and they became a little bit more structured. And so HARS is, part of a number of similar organizations in Ontario that are part of what's called the Ontario AIDS Network. And so I got a position doing sexual health education and community development, particularly for men who have sex with men back in 2013. And we were a small organization, as you mentioned earlier. We were 8 or 9 staff. And then so simultaneous to the HIV/AIDS crisis changing. So back in 1996 was the introduction of what's called highly active antiretroviral therapy, or what was known as the time as drug cocktails. And people who were on death's door were kind of reviving, and people they were calling it the Lazarus effect, right? So people who were at death's door were suddenly being, feeling well and could return to work in some cases. And, some, are alive to this day and living, stand to live healthy lives. And so the advent of, different ways of treating HIV, and now there's a whole lot of new, prevention strategies that exist. We're living in a different time where HIV/AIDS is concerned in the developed world. I mean, in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it continues to be a major challenge. Again, questions of privilege, right? And you can predict it. We've seen it in this pandemic, right? So what communities are disproportionately impacted? It's the marginalized. It's those who are living in poverty. It's racialized people. And so even though HIV/AIDS has changed a lot in North America, other crises have cropped up, and not the least of which is the drug poisoning crisis. And so, again, not a sexy or glamorous community. Just like HIV/AIDS was the thing that nobody wanted to touch. And so people don't want to touch or talk about substance use. They don't want to talk about the mental health challenges and the trauma that contributes to people's use of substances. We're living during a time where people really have to hustle in order to feel well. And we all self-medicate with something, to make us feel well. So whether it's, food,
Right.
or sex, or shopping, or whatever it is, but we stigmatize substance use. And so a lot of the work that we do now, in addition to providing support to people living with HIV, doing education, getting people aware of, emerging prevention strategies like PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, we do a lot of work around addressing the drug poisoning crisis. And so, yeah.
So I just want to stop you for a second.
Sure.
Because some of our listeners might not know what the drug poisoning crisis is. Can you break that, just briefly break that down for us?
Absolutely. So, people may have heard in the news about, the not necessarily drug poisoning crisis. They'll hear about it as like the opioid crisis. And so we broaden that a little bit because the crisis doesn't extend strictly to opioids. People have certainly heard about, OxyContin and how, OxyContin was taken off the market. And so you've got all of these people who were being prescribed this, who were then moved to another class of drugs if they had a doctor who was willing to do that. And so now you have all of these people who are taking fentanyl, and, there's whole systems level issues that make this a really complicated conversation. But the substances that people use, if they're not being prescribed appropriate medications to manage whatever challenge they have, and sometimes it's an issue of physical pain, but sometimes it's another condition that hasn't been diagnosed. And so, for example, a lot of people with ADHD self-medicate with caffeine and other substances that make them feel like they can function through their day. And so when you intersect that with poverty, adverse childhood experiences, the likelihood of people, looking to substances in order to feel well increases. And so the substances that people access, if they're not, receiving good care from a physician, are street drugs. And we don't know what's in them a lot of the times, and most of the substances are contaminated. And so we're seeing huge spikes in, people would refer to them as overdoses. They're not really overdoses, because overdose presumes that you're taking more of something than you
Right.
should. This is people, dosing what they would normally dose, except what they think they're taking is not what they're taking, or it's been cut with something else. And so we're seeing huge rates of people dying or experiencing drug poisoning as a result of not just, bad supply, but bad politics and bad laws that criminalize people who have experienced trauma or poverty or mental health challenges. And so a lot of the work we do now is really around addressing the immediate needs of people who experience complex trauma, mental health challenges, sometimes dual diagnosis, but also the systems level issues that contribute to, higher rates of problematic substance use.
Okay. Yeah. Listen, what you're doing is really important. And I was aware of the opioid crisis. I mean, it gets a lot of play. And I think again, it all goes back to marginalized communities, right? It just feels like one of the things the pandemic has lifted the cover off for, hopefully for a lot of people, is understanding privilege, right? Like the thin gauze that we hold over society and say, well, we're all equal here. Like, for example, in North America or in certain Western countries, and that is absolutely not true. And so, I mean, even looking at the vaccine rollouts and the access to pharmacies, right? Where you have a place like Rexdale in Toronto, which is a very wealthy place. And because it's wealthy, they have 12 pharmacies. And then you go to a place like Jane and Finch, where it's not very wealthy, and they don't have any pharmacies, or they have one.
Yeah.
And so this whole, my hope is that the pandemic has created an opportunity for people to see the uneven playing field that exists. And I mean, and you lived it, and you live it every day with your job. But I did want to ask, and this is not an entrepreneurial question, but you've grown your staff from 90 to 70. And in case there's another person listening, or some of the people listening to this podcast are interested in running an MPO, how did you manage to grow it? Because that's very much like growing a business, right? How did that happen?
Yeah, well, and I mean, this is a really good tie into what we were just talking about how the veil has been lifted, and COVID, if there is a silver lining, is that it has really shone a light on the, inequalities that exist in our society. So there's a couple of parts to the expansion of the organization, and one is, so about 3 years ago, and we've been aware of, and we've been referring to it as, the opioid crisis for a long time. We've been shifting the language around that because it's not just opioids that are causing drug poisoning. There's a whole lot of other substances that are tainted that are causing all sorts of problems. But a lot of our work is, the philosophy is harm reduction, is, minimizing people's unwanted negative impacts of whatever it is. So for example, sexual health, a harm reduction strategy might be using condoms. It might be using PrEP. Taking a ride in the car. Harm reduction is wearing your seatbelt. With substance use, things like having new injection equipment for each time that you use, not sharing equipment with somebody else when you're using. So we've been in the work of harm reduction for years and years and years. And in fact, this organization, as well as the local community health center, back in 91, I believe, were among the first in the province to start a needle and syringe program where you can bring in your used works and get new works. And so we've been in this work for a long, long time. And about 3 years ago, there was an opportunity to apply for some funding to expand our harm reduction programming. And so we were successful at getting a grant that would allow us to purchase a used ambulance and go to some of the communities around Kingston that receive fewer services so that we can distribute things like Narcan kits so that people can help reverse an opioid overdose. We can distribute new injection inhalation supplies and facilitate people getting rid of their used equipment. And so that grew the team a little bit. And one of the priorities when we applied for that funding was to hire as many people we could who had lived or living experience of substance use. And the magic that happened in making that very specific decision was that the ability to build a rapport with the people we serve when you've been there, when you're part of the community, has been way more effective than it could ever have been, for example, to hire people with all sorts of wonderful academic credentials that people work really, really hard for, and they have got all the head knowledge, but you're not always speaking the same language. And so that was it continues to be a really effective program, and it's what's led to the largest expansion of the organization, which is really only over the last 10 months. So when the pandemic began and things started shutting down, a lot of services that people who are marginalized depend on had to either close or reduce their services. And so, and of course, as people are locked down into their homes and not really mobile, or maybe they're working from home, they become more attuned to what's going on outside. And we started paying more attention to something that's been existing in the area, well, in most communities for a long, long time. And that's homeless encampments, tent cities, that kind of thing. And so our team with our mobile outreach unit was visiting these encampments, and we've over years built really good, trusting relationships with the people we serve who are living rough. And the city of Kingston said, we have some funds related to COVID relief that can be put towards addressing this challenge. And they saw the rapport that our team had with the people who were living in these encampments and said, can you think of something that might help? And so, and I can't take credit for this. I've got an extraordinary team of people, three in particular, people who very, very quickly pulled together a proposal that went to City Council and got funding for a pilot project to run what's called the Integrated Care Hub. And what that does is it provides three major services. One is a drop-in space where people can come and, get shelter from the elements, get some healthy food, use showers and washrooms, store their stuff. There's a rest zone where people can, sleep is important to stabilization, particularly if you are using substances. And then a safe consumption site, or in Ontario, we refer to them as consumption and treatment services. And so with this, we had to move very, very quickly to recruit the staff who are going to work this operation because it runs 24/7. And so we were a staff at the time of 16 back in June of last year. And by August, September, we were up to 70 staff. And so it was all a pilot project. We continue to just have, short-term funding that gets extended. Right now, we're funded through to the end of December, and we're hopeful that other levels of government will come to the table to make this a sustainable program. But what makes it unique is that it is informed by the people we serve. And so a lot of times people who are marginalized, people who experience mental health challenges, who use substances, don't have access to services because the benchmark around what the service provider expects can't be met by people. So for example, if you can't get mental health support because you're using substances, well, that's a barrier. If you can't get help with your with your substance use because you've got a significant mental health challenge that's causing erratic behavior. Well, that's a barrier. And so the idea is to provide low barrier care so that we can get people to a place of stabilization so that they can then engage with other services. And so it's a pretty cool model, and one that is clearly needed because we see on average 100 unique individuals a day. We have served, since we've opened, over 650 unique individuals. It speaks to, I mean, Kingston's not a huge place, but it speaks to the degree of the, crisis of both, drug poisoning, but also, lack of affordable housing, lack of supportive housing, and all the social determinants of health that we talk about.
And so for people listening who are not from Ontario, yeah. Kingston is about what, 500,000 people?
No, it's about 150, 160,000 people.
Oh,
yeah, and it's situated, between Toronto and Montreal off the 401. One of the interesting things about Kingston, as it relates historically to the drug culture, is it's kind of at the intersection of a major border crossing to the U.S., large centers like Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. It's on the 401 corridor where a lot of drug trafficking happens. And I learned something really cool that I think your listeners might find interesting as it relates to substance use stigma. Kingston has historically been known as a town where a lot of people, their drug of choice is crystal meth. And it's a substance that's not well understood by the broader community. People understand opiates. They understand, the idea of, a painkiller, that kind of thing. Don't understand crystal meth quite as well. I didn't either. And in speaking with individuals who experience homelessness, crystal meth is actually a substance that they use in order to stay awake through the night when they feel most vulnerable, because it's a stimulant. It's something that keeps you awake. And so when I heard that, the penny dropped, and I thought, oh gosh, if people actually had a safe place to stay, that might impact the degree to which they use crystal meth. If it's in fact part of a coping strategy or resilient strategy in order to feel safe when you're most vulnerable, when it's dark, when you're sleeping outside on a bench or in a tent, it kind of stands to reason why that might be a helpful thing to do. And so when I understood it that way, suddenly it didn't become this kind of nefarious thing. It became actually a practical and really, frankly, clever strategy that people are using. The unintended negative consequences can be really severe, but the genesis of people, a number of people using crystal meth, is simply an issue of poverty and lack of housing. And so yeah, it's really interesting. And it's the more that I do this work, the more that I realize that I have been privileged to not have been, exposed to that world. And yet how rich your experience is when you get to know people who use substances and learn their stories, because there's nobody that I know who are more resilient than the people that we serve.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to having a friend of mine on the show who works with homeless people and in Toronto, and she advocates for them. She works out of a church called Sanctuary. And, even just listening to her describe her wedding where she had all of her friends, and what a riot it was. But when you're in it with these people all the time, Gilles, do you ever get a little bit overwhelmed? I know that there are times when people say, well, watch this movie and it's really sad, and I'm like, I don't need to watch a sad movie, man. I turned on the news today, that was pretty sad, and I'm not in that all the time, but you are. And so we'll extend this to any of my listeners who are wanting to do what you do and work with it or do what you do. How do you cope with being in that all the time?
There's no question, it's heartbreaking work. And it's heartbreaking work both because you empathize with the experiences of the people who you serve, the trauma that they've experienced, the hurt that they have, the sense of, frustration and sometimes hopelessness. And so there's that heartbreak, and there's the heartbreak of somebody who you build a rapport with, and you can see the struggle, and that you can only do so much, and it's part of living in a broken system and in a world that stigmatizes and chooses to look away. So that part's heartbreaking. The other part is the anger that comes from looking at, gosh, if we could only just fix this. And when you become more familiar with the issues and go, gosh, if we could just decriminalize substance use, if we could only ensure safe supply, so many of the things that we encounter would be fixed. So how do you get through it? Well, I think for me, now I'm not a frontline worker, so I've already got the benefit of that distance, but I am supporting a staff of heartbroken people. And so for me, it's important to have, creative outlets. It's also important to have, so a friend of mine, I don't know where he got this term, but he shared it with me and said that I could use it. My honest posse. So having that group of people who are going to shoulder me up at work, who are not necessarily connected to it, although that's helpful too, because it's always helpful to talk to somebody who gets it. But to have people outside as well who will hold the mirror up to me when I'm being a jerk. So that's the whole honest posse bit, but they're your lifelines. So the people who can, for a moment, sort of take you out of things. What I'm learning, Stephen, the more that I do this work is my patience for what I refer to as first world problems gets smaller and smaller. So I've become like the worst person at a cocktail party, because if somebody is complaining about, they picked up their car, their brand new car, and it wasn't exactly the color they wanted and how angry they are, I'm thinking like, oh boy, yeah, you got problems.
Don't say anything. Don't say anything. Don't say anything. No, I'm going to say something.
It's really hard. It's, I would say, surrounding yourself with people who can support you, and support doesn't have to be anything more than just holding space, for those days that are really shitty, and where you can just go like, this sucks. The systems or lack of systems suck. It's unjust. It's unethical, and there's that the thing that motivates me too. So again, back to your question is, it's not hard to find meaning in this work. The work is meaningful, and you can see how it's meaningful as you do it. What gets challenging is progress. Feeling like, okay, you can see where this is leading, and it's never a happy ending. And so finding those moments where you can be like, okay, that was a right conversation with the right people in the room who can make decisions that can influence and change things. This feels like progress. Or on a micro level, a relationship that you've been cultivating that's been really challenging with one of the people that you serve or with one of the staff, and you can see, oh, they're relating to me a little bit differently today, or, oh, they're agreeable to trying this new thing. And you look for those moments of progress, because if you can't identify even small progress, it's hard to not lose hope.
Yeah, I love this. I love the idea of small moments, because now in your field, right, in what you do, those small moments are going to help balance just sort of the awfulness that you're swimming in, right? Like the marginalization, the poverty. Anybody with any empathy at all is going to feel at times like they're drowning. But it's also true, I think, for entrepreneurs and artists. And I talked about this in another episode, where you're always kind of swimming upstream. So finding those moments, and I think a lot of like artists for sure, and entrepreneurs, and I think that there is this sense in all of them of being a tiny bit of an outsider. And so, so finding those moments of progress, like this is better, is important. And the other thing, the last thing, and we're gonna wrap this up, but the last thing I wanted to say is I love the concept of holding space, and I don't I don't feel enough people understand that to empathize with people, it is not necessarily about you saying the right thing. It in fact is often you not saying anything at all. And one of the phrases that I learned early on when I've done special needs work forever with kids is that sucks, and like that sucks, or this sucks. And all you're doing is giving people an opportunity to be heard, and not trying to impose, well, we got to fix this, or we got to do this. No, just hold the space, right? And it's remarkable how we do that. And the example I would give for people listening is when you call a friend and you're having a bad day and they just let you vent, right? And suddenly you feel better, right? And I wish collectively as a society that we would do a better job of holding space for people who use substance abuse, for minorities, for the poor, for the LGBTQ community. Can we just hold space instead of rushing to judge? Just hold the space, right? And listen, like hear the story. And that's why I was so happy that you were coming on today to tell your story. And folks, you don't know this, but I could have Gilles on again and tell more of his story. There's lots, but I think this is a great glimpse into a field, the one you work in, that's so important, but into also, how somebody gets to where you get, and you've been so successful. One last thing I'll just ask you as a parting gift, if you will, to our listeners is, what advice would you give to someone who either wants to work in your field, or because you were also an entrepreneur, what advice would you give?
Well, there's a few things. So, in the field that I'm in, or, if you're wanting to get into, nonprofit work or charitable work, is really, find the cause that lights you up. We all have that thing, whether it's something related to health, or whether it's children or animals or the environment or whatever it is. Find your cause. You may not be able to be, employed full time in, a role like mine right away. But if you're passionate about it, you'll be happy to do the work. And build relationships with people who are connected to that area, that thing that lights you up, because it's the whole thing about it's who you know. There's some truth to that from the standpoint of it may connect you to opportunities, but also just to glean their wisdom, because sometimes it's a great opportunity to try something on and see if it really does fit for you or not. From an entrepreneurial standpoint, from my business experience, part of the advice is, again, looking for those moments of progress, but also speaking as somebody who, has opened and closed a couple of, small businesses now, know when it's time to go. Because I think a lot of us wrap up our identity in what we do, and the closing of those chapters can be experienced as a failure. And so I think about, when I closed my retail store back in 2013, I think it was 2012, 2013. And I incurred a lot of debt, with that experience. And I had a tough time afterwards thinking like, oh gosh, what have I done? What does this cost my family as far as, from a debt standpoint? And then thinking, okay, I could also have prolonged this to try to, rescue it or try to wrestle something out. But sometimes the writing's on the wall, and it's okay to go, I'm going to cut my losses, because I've seen people struggle and struggle and struggle. And it's apparent to everyone around that it's either not the time for the idea or it's not the place. But we dig our feet in because our identity is tied to whether or not we're successful. The last thing I'll say is, it's sometimes we don't get to do the work that lights us up, and our job is the thing that facilitates other things in our life that light us up. So I've had times where I've, languished in the corporate world where I'm like, okay, I know I can do more than this, or I know this isn't my quote unquote calling, but it's provided me financial resources or time off so that I can do those things that I'm really passionate about, getting involved in, board work or, or creative projects or whatever it is. And I think our society puts so much import around a job title and what it means, and it's more about like look for those opportunities to do those things that light you up. You may get paid for it, you might not, but yeah, I think.
Well,
yep.
Yeah, like I was just going to say, I can tell people this. I've worked as a day job as a special needs worker, and I've said this on the show before for over 25 years. But I took the job when I was in my early 20s because I wanted to be a writer, and I didn't want a job that I took home with me. And so now that there are emotional days, like emotionally challenging times, you take some of that home, but it would give me time to do the thing that I wanted to do, which is to write. And so now, working as a professional editor and creating an online writing course, all of that has come about. There were a lot of situations where I wasn't really happy in whether it was a certain group home that I was working in or a certain situation in a school. But like you said, that's okay. Don't identify with that. And the other thing I'll say to what you just said is the idea of if you have to close a business, and again, we reiterate this on the show all the time, that if you're an entrepreneur, it may be, right, especially if you're doing something online, that your packaging is wrong, or maybe, right, you just haven't found the audience, yet, and so it doesn't devalue what you do or what you've created. And so trying and maintaining that distinction between the product that you create or the thing that you're what you're trying to build with yourself is really important. Listen, Gilles, this has been terrific, man. I just want to know, I'm going to put links down below, but people can reach you or find you, or can people make donations to your organization?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the best place to learn about the organization is through our website and our social media channels. We're in the process of going through a rebranding exercise. So this is kind of, right now, the way to reach us is HARS.ca, HARS.ca, or on social media, in particular, Facebook and Instagram at HARS Kingston. And on our website, there is a donate link right on the homepage.
Awesome. You guys are doing amazing work. Send a shout out from me to you guys. I mean, we're so lucky to have people like you stepping in and doing these important things. So again, the links are below. Folks, if you get a chance, it's an unbelievable organization that Gilles is running, and they do unbelievable work. And so please donate, or at least inform yourself more about the topic. Anyway, that's it for this week's show. My name is Stephen Burns. This is Project Dreammaker. Gilles Charette, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you, Stephen.